go back to welcoming everyone, or?
Oh, just a...
Okay, then I want to welcome everybody to tonight's Schiller Institute meeting, which is on the 8th of December, 2021. This will be first in a series of presentations on the study in poetic principle, on metaphor and the significance of the poetic principle in determining and shaping world history. You can see from the title of the presentation itself that the subtopic, how the philosophy of the human mind shapes the development and the direction of world history. Now that is a concept which is little or not understood in the present circumstances that we find ourselves in world history, which is part of the reason that we are in danger of tragic developments. And it is no accident when we look closely at the history of the poetic and dramatic contributions which have come from the greatest philosophical and poetic geniuses, William Shakespeare in England and Friedrich Schiller from Germany, in at least the most near 200 to 300 years. Of course, one can go back, and we will to a degree, in understanding some of the background, but the nature of the dramatic work that we will come to at a later point, that is presented in the plays of William Shakespeare, some of which are known to people, others which are less known, represent a very clear picture of the kind of problem in terms of what we are facing today. It is a similar situation, even addressing the works of Friedrich Schiller, especially in the works that Friedrich Schiller took up in the historical context, the Wallenstein, and other of his dramatic plays, which were characterized to point out to not only the immediate public in England or in Germany, but to the human race and the public in world history. So this concept of understanding the nature of the human mind, which is very little discussed in today's world, in the context of political discussions, political debates, the crisis that may exist between East and West, between China and the Western world, the reference to a dialogue of cultures is a step in the right direction, but it does not fully characterize the nature of how world history is being defined by precisely these concepts which we are going to begin to look into. And this first presentation will give people a general idea of this, and then we will come to certain examples of poetic contributions, not only from Shakespeare, but in this particular case, from a follower of Shakespeare, very close follower of Shakespeare in English poetic history by the name of John Keats. So I'm going to go to the next slide. Now, this is not off the topic. It's very much in the context of what one can begin to grasp how the poetic principle functions. And that is without actually comprehending the philosophical side of how we can look at the nature of the human mind and its relationship to the physical universe, there is unfortunately little or no ability to grasp the foundations of truth and to be able to mediate and communicate those, especially in the political debates ongoing, as I've mentioned, in the present crisis in the world, whether it be Afghanistan, whether it be the military crisis, which perhaps we can go into at a later point in the meeting, or the economic crisis, which is certainly a big part of it. However, without understanding the philosophical, theological thinking of G.W. Leibniz, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who lived from 1646 until 1716, and was directly involved in a ongoing, constant political as well as philosophical and theological debate with virtually all of the thinkers of his time, who have nonetheless and have and continue nonetheless to characterize the nature of how people in the world think. Whether they are conscious of how they think or not, the outlines of the thinkers that Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz was in a conscious debate with: number one, Thomas Hobbes; number two, René Descartes; number three, Benedict Spinoza; number four, John Locke; number five, Isaac Newton; and even in the so-called 1700s and into the beginning of the 1800s, Immanuel Kant, although his interpretations were somewhat different than the initial individuals who I've already mentioned. Nonetheless, their view of how the human mind works is clearly defined on the basis of empiricism, on the basis of what means, how do you know things? Well, according to the empiricist and the materialist, the way that you gain knowledge, even as a human being, is no fundamentally different than how other animals and other living creatures also get their knowledge, and that is through sense certainty. That is what you see, what you hear, what you taste, what you feel, what you smell. That is the basis and the input upon which we know things. John Locke even explicitly philosophized that people are born, human beings are born with a blank slate, a white tablet that is nothing. And the only basis in which you built up your knowledge was through the input that you got through sense certainty. Now, I'm not going to be able to go through every aspect of each of these philosophical thinkers at this point, but it is certainly okay to address this or ask questions about this in the course of this presentation and discussion, because if you don't really understand the thinking of these empiricists and how they reflect on the nature of the human mind, you cannot either understand the way that people are thinking in this present moment in history, whether they have ever heard of Thomas Hobbes or John Locke, they are unfortunately in one form or another victims of this kind of empiricist philosophy. And that type of empiricist philosophy is of such a nature that you cannot understand the concept of metaphor or the poetic principle. And in fact, according to their way of thinking, it does not even exist as such. That is, the reasoning capacity of the human mind, which is identified and understood in the historical context by Plato and Platonic thinkers. That concept of the nature of the human mind, the essence of the human thought process, is not a part of the understanding or the worldview of the empiricists. And that has enormous consequences. It has enormous consequences both for the political nature of how people see the world, as well as the cultural nature in terms of how it affects how we see things like poetry, and why poetry, as we will get to, is of such importance. Okay, so one thing that I will say that is very relevant about Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, there are some people either who have been in previous discussions with me in the Schiller Institute about the work of Leibniz. And there are some, or at least one individual, Yarley, who has been ongoing in discussions about the significance of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz for world history and world political thinking today. Not in his own time, but of course, his own time, and how that is relevant for all aspects of what is presently ongoing in modern history and world history. Now, what is it that's so essential? What is so essential is, number one, Leibniz had a view, not alone that there is a creator in his religious point of view, as a reference to God or the creator. That idea theologically was that the nature of the creator of the universe had, number one, the idea of all knowing, all powerful, and all loving. That is not simply a tyrant who could decide what he wills and impose it, but rather a view that the very nature of the creative power of the creator of the universe was coherent and is coherent with the idea of what is wise, what is all-knowing. And in that context, Leibniz defined the idea that nothing happens in the world without a cause and its effects. Now, that very concept does not exist for the most part in Western civilization at this point. Does not exist at all. The idea that there is a guiding principle upon which there are clear aspects of how people act and how they think that shapes the very nature of all happenings and events in world history is not something that is an active principle whatsoever in the political thinking of today. And therefore, what you have for example, in Western civilization, is a power structure in the primarily European Union and in the United States, which has no reference to the idea of truth. There's no significance. There is no idea that they have a responsibility to the nature of truth, neither either internally or globally. And consequently, they can invent whatever scenario or interpretation of reality that they wish and claim that this is reality. And we see this, for example, from the leader of NATO, Stoltenberg, and his allies, Anthony Blinken and Biden, who are deciding that the Russians are threatening to invade Ukraine and neglecting to tell anybody that it was they who ran an orange coup against Yanukovych and imposed a government from outside that defines the new and the present government of Ukraine. That reality is non-existent according to the manner in which they address the ongoing questions of the world. Now, there are other aspects of it as well. We can refer briefly to the present decision to boycott diplomatically the Olympics in China by President Biden. Based on what? Based on the idea that China has got concentration camps in Xinjiang. Now, we held a seminar in the BRICS to demonstrate that that scenario had no substance to it, and it doesn't. But that doesn't stop the leaders of the West from imposing a scenario that is completely disregarding the nature of cause and effect and truth. It doesn't exist. It has no bearing. Now, what are the consequences of that? Well, that gets down to the very nature of what Shakespeare was doing and what Schiller was doing. That is, can mankind escape the real consequences of its thinking and the nature of how it addresses the nature of the human mind without consequences that are going to affect every aspect of our civilization and our life? And the answer to that is no, you cannot. They cannot. What has been and what is happening in the general phase of Western civilization, which is in a tragic phase of total breakdown, economically, politically, and in every other form, in which the thinking processes of the leadership in any political context that we presently notice, for the most part, there are exceptions, but for the most part, the ones who are the exceptions are previous thinkers, leaders, but not people who are in the active decision-making process. And that means that when you, as I go back to Leibniz, deny the philosophical foundation that there is nothing that happens in this universe, including all human activity, that does not have direct effects and consequences. And unless you are operating intelligently on that basis in all aspects of how civilization and decisions for cooperation are based, the implications are only tragic. And this is what over and over again the great dramatists have referred to. Now, that's what's at stake right now. This is not just an academic discussion of poetic principle or drama. because we are now in a period where we need, in a certain sense, to find the thinking process which will elevate and grasp a great number or a sufficient number of citizens to the level that I'm referring to here with Leibniz, in order to counter and overcome the kind of erroneous and destructive thinking that is presently dominating virtually all aspects of our civilization. All right, so we go to the next slide. Now, here I'm going to give you what I've referred to already, which is Leibniz is a later thinker that is built on the philosophical thinking of Plato. And here you have a very important distinction in the form of understanding poetry between Plato and Aristotle. And this resonates all through history in terms of understanding poetry that is essentially representative of the human thought process as well as the lack of it. So let me read these if you cannot see them, and I hope that if you have some points or questions on this, I will open the at least discussion a bit so that this part is very clear. This is from the Phaedo. The Phaedo was the third part of the of Socrates. The first part was the I think, what is it called in Swedish? Gästabud, it's disappeared from my mind right now. If somebody has it, they can help me. The apology. And this is a reference to Socrates in the context where he is recognizing the inevitability that he will not run from the Athenian democracy that has decided that he will be executed because he is corrupting the youth by going around and inquiring into what they know and what they don't know and what they think they know and what they really should know. So what does he say? He says, this is Socrates speaking, "The same dream came to me often in my past life, sometimes in one form and sometimes in another, but always saying the same thing. Socrates, it said, make music, poetry, and work at it. And I formerly thought it was urging and encouraging one to do what I was doing already. And that just as people encourage runners by cheering, so the dream was encouraging one to do what I was doing, that is, to make music, because philosophy was the greatest kind of music. And I was working on that. But now I thought it was safer not to go hence, i.e. to his death, before making sure that I had done what I had done, what I ought to, by obeying the dream and composing verses." So here you have an idea of a Platonic notion that even in the face of his own mortality, Socrates and Plato is looking at the importance not only of their mortality, their life here, but what he has as a mission in his lifetime, which is the philosophical mission and the idea of making music through philosophy, through the thought process, and composing verses. Okay, on the other side, what do you get from Aristotle? This is coming from Aristotle's Poetics. He says, it is clear that the general origin of poetry was due to two causes, each of them part of human nature. Imitation is natural. Imitation is natural, is man from childhood. And it is also natural for all delight in works of imitation. Though the objects themselves may be painful to see, we delight to view the most realistic representations of them in art. The forms, for example, of the lowest animals and of dead bodies. The explanation is found in a further fact. To be learning something is of the greatest pleasures. The reason of the delight in seeing the picture is that one is at the same time learning, gathering the meaning of things, that is, that the man there is so and so. For if one has not seen the things before, one's pleasure will not be in the picture as in imitation of it, but will be due to the execution or coloring of some similar cause. Okay, the point is Aristotle is clearly defining the context of the Poetics from the imitation of what you see, of imitation of nature. Gets back to the very point of sense certainty. Now, that does not mean that you can't have imitations of nature which are not attractive or enhancing or encouraging. But this is how Aristotle defines the notion of poetics. It is through the imitation of what you see. And the recognition of the power of the mind is not there. It's missing. And that becomes the standard for many poetic, so-called poetic thinkers who are on the other side of both this philosophical and poetic concept. Okay, we go to the next. Are there questions about this? Anything that you would rather have clarified more? Otherwise, I go further. Okay, here you have one of the English poets who was not exactly a contemporary of Friedrich Schiller, but was not long after Schiller and lived actually as a young man for some years before Friedrich Schiller died. And this quote is been referenced in the work of the Schiller Institute for many decades. It's been referred to by the work of Lyndon LaRouche, and it comes and will come up in a deeper discussion of the document which has been referenced in the text that Ulf sent on the subject of metaphor, which was a document that LaRouche wrote in 1992. Okay, I'm going to read this quote from Percy Shelley. Is part of a document which is a much longer document, or essay, which is a defense of poetry. And what does he say? The most unfailing herald, companion, and follower of the awakening of a great people to work a beneficial change in opinion or institution is poetry. Now, that's a very strange statement. If you look at today's world, how many politicians have any idea or even think, especially when we define the term poetry in the proper manner of a classical poetry, which is based on metaphorical thought processes. And here he's saying, couldn't be more clear, the most unfailing herald, companion, and follower of the awakening of a great people to work a beneficial change in opinion or in institutions is poetry. At such periods, there is an accumulation of the power of communicating and receiving intense and impassioned conceptions respecting man and nature. The person in whom this power resides may often, as far as regards many portions of their nature, have little correspondence with that spirit of good of which they are the ministers. Now that you have to understand what he's saying. I don't know if you do. I want to put that on the floor now to see if people actually grasp that. I'll read the last line, and then I want to make the challenge to see that you really grasp what he is talking about. But even whilst they deny, they are yet compelled to serve the power which is seated upon the throne of their own souls. Okay, what's the point? Please don't give me silence. I want some, if you, om man vill prata svenska eller norska om det behövs, varsågod. Men I want some clarification as to how that strikes you. What happens inside your mind? What do you think he's saying?
He certainly say that there is no good in the person that's running the show.
Well, no, not necessarily. He's not saying that exactly.
May often.
No, he's saying the person in whom this power resides. He's talking about the impassion, the accumulation of the power of communicating and receiving intense and impassioned conceptions, respecting man and nature, okay? That's what he's talking about. And then he says the person in whom this power resides, that is the intense power of communicating and receiving intense and impassioned conceptions about man and nature. That person may often, as far as regards many portions of their nature, have little correspondence with the spirit of good of which they are the ministers. In a certain sense, what is he saying? He's saying that despite the flaws that people have, that when this quality of inspiration and profound and intense and impassioned conceptions is acting upon institutions and opinions, that despite the fact that many of the people who act on this are not by their own character good, they are the ministers nonetheless of this transmutation, this change, despite their flaws.
Jag kanske kan säga någonting där, Stig. Hör du mig?
Yeah.
So, in a way, what he's speaking about is a situation when there is a dramatic situation of change, maybe a revolution or something like that. And in such a situation, people are grasped by this spirit to start communicating, and they do it in a more and more intense and passionate conceptions. So they are increasing the level of discussion. And then he points to that this is grasping everyone, not only those who are really for the good development, but also those who are as I say, they have little correspondence with what is good. So even those people that are not outright evil, but they are basically not leaders in the good development, even they are grasped by this or caught by this spirit of discussion, and they can help the discussion forward as they maybe just take part in it, because the level of discussion in such a period is elevated, and that means that you have to, when you go into that discussion, you have to do it from an elevated level, and that means that they are taking part in the development to bring the development further into maybe a successful revolution. So
yeah, well, yes, but read the first line, the first sentence. He is first defining the basis upon which a change can occur in a positive way. I mean, these individuals, Schiller, Shelley, and Keats were all, and some of their precursors who I will go into later, like there's a discussion point on that, but Wordsworth and especially Coleridge, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. They were Coleridge and Schiller and so they were adults, young adults, when the French Revolution occurred. They all knew what happened. They all knew that the spirit, which had, in one sense, raised the population from overcoming the oppression, the tyranny, the injustice that characterized the European political situation, which had partly successfully succeeded in freeing the American colonies and founding of the United States. And the hope was that Europe will achieve a similar result. And it failed entirely. It was a catastrophe. It was a total tragedy, a bloodbath. And it led to what? To Napoleon, a dictator of the worst type. So now Shelley is writing this after Napoleon. Napoleon had been slightly, he writes this in 1818. Napoleon is out of the picture. However, Schiller, as well as Keats and Shelley, were both identifying what is the character of the human thought process that is necessary to lift the population from its present degradation and lack of understanding to a level through the poetic principle that will define their ability to act in the manner that represents the good. That's what he's saying. Without that, you could get, and history has shown over and over again, that what you get is quite the opposite. Mass strikes, mass revolutions, socialist revolutions, and they're based on what? Marxism, socialism. It's based on empiricism. It's a total denial of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz and the philosophical point that I began with. So the consequence of not recognizing the poetic principle as a determining aspect of history means you will get the consequences of the type that the French Revolution represented and what even throughout the period of history since then has led over and over again to tragic consequences, world wars. Now we can define this as the oligarchical principle, but the oligarchical principle is based on an Aristotelian empiricist idea that human beings are no different than the beasts in that knowledge and the capacity to act are all determined by sense certainty. You begin with that as your fundamental orientation and axiom, you are doomed. Civilizations that act that way are doomed. And right now, Western civilization, in the way it is acting, is from the standpoint of the historical context as well as the individuals who are at the present in the position of so-called decision making. They're following the same course. And the consequences, that's what they're talking about. That's what Shakespeare's talking about. That's what Schiller was talking about. And then they say that unless you raise the level of human reflection and understanding of the metaphorical poetic principle, you are doomed to repeat mistakes and consequences over and over again. Okay, let's go to Augustine. Now, Augustine was a follower of the Platonic thought process as a Platonic Christian. And of course, the emergence of Christianity as a transition, although the foundations of which are still very openly connected to the Platonic thinking. And here you see a theological standpoint of Augustine in the work that he wrote in his lifetime, the Musica. Okay, what does he say? He says, he's talking about poetry. He says, it is the purpose of it is to lead young people of ability, and perhaps older people too, gradually with reason for our guide, from things of sense to God, in order that may cling to him who rules all and governs our intelligence with no mediating nature between. It is the ascent from rhythm in sense to the immortal rhythm, which is the truth. Now that is a very powerful precursory to a Leibnizian viewpoint. The immortal rhythm, which is not connected to the senses, it is connected to the mind, to the power of the mind that is the transformer and determinant of human behavior and human, or should be, of civilization in reference to its common good, its common interests. It's there. It's could not be, I think it could not be more clear. Okay, I don't know if there's any comment or question on that point, but I think that the expression from Augustine is as good as one could ask for a kind of previous connection or connection between Plato and the reference point that I began with the thinking of Leibniz. And I stress the thinking of Leibniz is an active principle. It is not some historical thought process that no longer exists or functions. It is the unfortunate fact that the direction of human history has abandoned, for the most part, Leibnizian thinking. And the only exception to that was fundamentally the work of Lyndon LaRouche. And Lyndon LaRouche, over and over again in his lifetime, even up to the very end when he writes on monadology, says, it is Leibniz that influenced and gave me the creative power and spark to become what I've become. And what was and what has been the result of Lyndon LaRouche's intervention into history. Okay, much was accomplished, but primarily, if we look at the reception of the thinking of Lyndon LaRouche in the US, in Western civilization, in Western Europe, in Sweden, in France, it is a rejection of the Leibnizian thinking. It is a rejection of LaRouche as a follower of the Leibnizian thinking. And that is the tragic nature that I'm speaking about, which goes and directly in the form of Shakespeare, if we take Hamlet, or we can take other plays which Shakespeare was a master of, in giving people the possibility, the public, to recognize these principles in order to shape the direction of human history in the proper and positive way that we look for. Okay, the last thing I will say for tonight is John Keats' ode. Now, I will read this. I don't know if I put it in here. It's not exactly the right size, which puts it somewhat problematic. I don't know if I can manage to increase I tried to, but I put it in a wrong context, so I'll have to adjust that. But the problem is the text is rather small. I don't know if you can see let me see if I can move this up. Yeah, okay, you can maybe read that?
Yep.
All right, I'm going to read that. There are several odes, among many other things, that John Keats wrote. And John Keats was in an open fight against the poets who were the product of the Enlightenment. And by the Enlightenment, I've already referenced to Hobbes, to Descartes, to John Locke, to Isaac Newton. These were the icons. And they were the icons of the political so-called, whatever you want to call the revolutionaries of the French Revolution, the empiricists, the failure, the disaster. And John Keats was an open debater and opponent of the Enlightenment. In fact, he got a lot of grief from even his own networks because he dared to imply that Isaac Newton was not the hero and the icon of English society, which everyone should worship. And he points out that the mathematical thinking, which defined the Enlightenment poets, the mathematical thinking, which we'll get to more about, maybe not tonight, but we'll get back to it, to define it more specifically. That kind of poetry was everything that Keats was against and strove in his own lifetime and his own creative power to overcome. So I will read this. This is only a short poem. There are others that Ulf put together which are a bit longer, and they're also a bit more complex. And we will begin to see why the complexity of this poetry is challenging. It's challenging, believe me, it's as challenging for an English audience as it will be for a Swedish or a Norwegian, because the thought process is what is the problem. Now, there are details of it which I can outline, but it is not just the language, it is the entire conceptual apparatus of how poetry is composed. That's what is the biggest problem. And that Enlightenment side of thinking, which I said is dominant philosophically, is also dominant culturally in one form or another in the present period as well, which we characterize often as degenerate culture, which in a great sense of the term it is. But many of the people who partake in this are completely unconscious or unaware of the kind of cultural decadence that they are engaged in, which is also one of the implications of tragedy. Okay, I'll read this now. Bards of passion and of mirth, ye have left your souls on earth. Have ye souls in heaven too, double-lived in regions new? Yes, and those of heaven commune with the spheres of sun and moon, with the noise of fountains wondrous, and the pearl of voices thunderous, with the whisper of heaven's trees, and one another in soft ease seated on Elysian lawns, browsed by none but Dian's fawns, underneath large bluebells tented, where the daisies are rose-scented, and the rose herself has got perfume, which on earth is not, where the nightingale does sing, not a senseless trance thing, but divine melodious truth, philosophic numbers smooth, tales and golden histories of heaven and its mysteries. Thus ye live on high, and then on earth ye live again. And the souls ye left behind, you teach us here the way to find you, where your other souls are joying, never slumbered, never cloying. Here your earth-born souls still speak to mortals of their little week, of their sorrows and delights, of their passions and their spites, of their glory and their shame, what does strengthen and what maim. Thus ye teach us every day wisdom, though fled far away. Bards of passion and of mirth, ye have left your souls on earth. Ye have souls in heaven too, double-lived in regions new. Okay, I can help if it's difficult, but I mean, it's a rather straightforward song to the immortality of the poetic genius that lives in immortality. He speaks, and this comes as a resonance and a repetition, but a repetition that reminds you of what you hear in the first lines and comes again at the very end of the ode, where he says, "Bards of passion and of mirth, ye have left your souls on earth." Okay, what is he saying? These great poets have no longer alive. Have ye souls in heaven too, double-lived in regions new? Then he's asking the question. He's not giving a clear statement or answer. He's saying, you're gone. You're no longer, your mortal lives are gone. But this concept of double-lived in regions new, that is the regions of immortality. And then at the end, bards of passion and of mirth, ye have left your souls on earth. Ye have souls in heaven too, double-lived in regions new. And now he's asserting it. It's no longer a question that he begins with in the beginning of the ode. And then he develops this through a series of stanzas, which result in this, what do you call, a kind of resolution at the very end, where he repeats what he began with, but the repetition is of a totally different character that reminds you of what he took up in the beginning, but gives you a different resolution and effect. Now, this is the kind of thing Keats does all the time, because Keats is addressing the power of the mind, even in his letters, which, I mean, I understand the limitations that some people may have, but if I could recommend for those who are inspired and encouraged to do it, the letters of John Keats. Because these letters, I mean, Keats lived only 25 years, and most of the letters are in the last 4 to 5 years of Keats's life. And he speaks through them of the very ideas that motivate him as a poet. And it's perhaps the most deepest insight that is available, especially to the great English writers of poetry, that exists. It's very personal and very moving, because he is speaking to his closest, he's writing to his closest friends, his brothers, his sister, and Fanny Brown, who is in the end his lover, which unfortunately fails because of his illness when he dies of tuberculosis at the age of 25. But nonetheless, even in the period of such a short lifetime, Keats attained a certain level of poetic genius and metaphor that is hardly surpassed. Now, he had contemporaries Shelley, who I mentioned earlier in the power of his defense of poetry. But there is hardly an English poet in the most modern period who can challenge Keats. There are some. I'm going to go into it. There is a link between Keats and then an earlier poetic thinker and philosophical thinker who I didn't mention, but I will get back to. I mentioned him earlier, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. And that leads into into the middle of the 1800s to Edgar Allan Poe and Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who do represent an effort to reestablish the link of poetic thinking. And Keats makes it very, very clear that his development of poetic ideas are inspired from ancient Greece and Dante. And he writes, and we'll get into this later, at a later presentation, how his poetry, his couplets, reflect the canzoni of Dante Alighieri. And he openly states that it is Dante and then Shakespeare that define the standard by which the great poetic thinking can be recovered, despite the horrible influence of the Enlightenment. Anyway, we are in, unfortunately, a period that is still philosophically completely dominated by empiricism and enlightenment, and the concept of truth as a fundamental principle in the universe. It has no meaning. You look at what these political leaders do. They invent things. Sometimes they invent things because they're ignorant, but they have no regard for the fact of whether it is truthful and reflective of a higher principle. Or, in the worst cases, which is a trademark of the oligarchy, but it is not solely the oligarchy. And that is the political geniuses of today who simply come out with a scenario. Is it based on reality or on cause and effect and truth? Has no bearing. It's not a consideration. The consideration is, what do we want to achieve from the vantage point of our own personal power or perception of what we conceive to be power? That is the recipe for tragedy, and we are in the middle of it. Okay, I will stop there and open the floor for remarks, discussion, debate. I hope there will be some input, although we are not so many.
I guess it is as it is with everything else. We have to read to try to find out how it is, because I'm totally blind on this.
Well, I understand that these are new things, what I'm saying.
But it helps a lot when you set the conception of it, because then you understand the beginning and you also know what you have to look against or look for. So that helps.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this, for example, people talk about poetry today. That's not a new subject. You can find it in every cultural section. You know, you have this, what's her name? Amanda Gorman, who everybody thinks was so cute when she read this poem at the inauguration. Now, maybe she's a cute little girl and she's maybe potentially got some potential clever capabilities, but her poem had nothing to do with anything that defines what is classical principles. And the thrust of what has occurred, which is a direct result of empiricism, philosophically, is that poetry has to do with your innermost feelings and how you can express your innermost feelings in images that wake up sensuous results or consequences in the readers. Now, that can be erotic, that can be all kinds of things, but the point is, poetry is not how do you elevate the human thought process as a determining factor in shaping the direction of world history, as Shelley identifies, and as they identify, Schiller identifies these things and says, if you behave in these ways, you will have the disaster and the consequences, the tragedies, which have been repeated again and again. Now, I mean, it's easy to say, well, there's an oligarchy, they have the power, we stupid little peons, you know, we can't do very much because all we can do is try and find a career, a job, love and support our families, but not really that much more. We're not historically capable of intervening into the nature of human history. Well, that's what's happening right now. Human history is being shaped and is and has been shaped at every instant. And unless we create the context for the type of thing that Shelley and Schiller and Keats and Shakespeare are defining as the nature of how the human mind should function in the context of physical reality, including economic reality. Unless we change that, then you're going to see these types of disastrous consequences. Now, there are some potentially fortunate aspects of the present world, which is China is not operating entirely from these kinds of axiomatic philosophical thinking. They have a different idea, which I went into partly in the BRICS seminar, that Xi Jinping is a philosophical thinker. He thinks deeply and has a view which is in Chinese culture connected to Confucius. And as I pointed out in my webinar, he is aware of Leibniz because Leibniz had a very clear idea of how Europe and China could collaborate for the benefit of mankind, including working with Russia. Back to Leibniz. Why is Leibniz no longer of any importance or relevance? Because our civilization is decaying tragically. And you can't expect that politicians who have pea brains, as it is, I'm sorry, I have to say, they have pea brains. They're not all bad people. but their thought processes are often pathetic, and there is too little motivation on the general aspects of political action and leadership to even reflect and wonder if what they're doing really has anything to do with the common good of mankind. So what does that imply? It implies that we have incompetence. We have people who make decisions about electrical power, who make decisions about reference to what happens in Afghanistan, if they're even making those decisions. They're passively supporting them. They're supporting decisions which are leading very close to the threat of conflict, again, because of Ukraine. And why? If you just, without having to know all the details, but I can assure you that if you would examine the thought processes, and I hope you wouldn't get sick to your stomach, of Jens Stoltenberg, that you would see that the gentleman has nothing of any depth or reference to the type of things that we discussed, and no general interest. He's a puppet. He does what he is as a certain consequence of his upbringing and other things, simply mechanically lives out, as most others are doing. That has to change. If we want to rescue our civilization, we have to create a movement. And poetry, when you begin to understand the philosophical base, and that's why I raised it, because if you don't know the philosophical base for what defines classical poetry, you can't even begin to understand how classical poetry is entirely different in its nature from everything that is called modern poetry or existential poetry or other things. Whether there are images that appear to be somewhat creative or useful, yes. I mean, you read modern poetry, you can always find some kind of creative image or whatever, but the ability to understand the construction of poetry as a classical device to uplift and elevate the thinking of the population and individuals, to be able to respond to the challenge of history,